curious, I gather some of you, that this is a class for some of you, and others are here as a generous audience. And can anyone tell me quickly what the class's preoccupations are? Yeah. Bay Area writers. Well, this, you certainly from my from all the friends of my life, this place has been an extraordinary center. And I grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and although that had an awfully august literary history, at the time that I arrived, it was pretty faint. Or let's say it was tended to be dominated by the Harvard University, and so a young writer in that sort of emotion. Tell me quickly what the all the friends of mine, although that had an awful literary history, at the time that was pretty faint. Or let's say it was tended to be by the university. So a young writer in that. I'm curious. I gather some of you that this is a class for some of you, and others are here as a generous audience. And can anyone tell me quickly what the class from all the friends of my life, this place has been an extraordinary center. And I grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and although that had an awfully august literary history, at the time that I arrived, it was pretty faint. Or let's say it was tended to be dominated by the Harvard University, and so a young writer in that social pattern either felt placed with that with that august social sort of moneyed group, or else you felt very out of step. I was really charmed that my mother supported us, my sister and myself, after my father's death when I was 4. She went back to nursing, and she was the town nurse for the towns of Acton, West Acton, North Acton, East Acton, South Acton, and Acton Center. And one of my heroes as a young man trying to be a writer was Kenneth Patchen. And I was really charmed that one day she came back from some call she'd made and said she'd seen the picture of that man I, was so much reading on the mantelpiece in this charming older couple's home. And it turned out that they were Miriam's father and mother, the Oikomises, from, I think they lived in North Acton. And they were old-time he was an old-time labor, not organizer, but his heart and life activity were much committed to the local unions around Maynard, Mass, and textile unions. And they're very proud of their son-in-law. But that was about the closest I ever got to a writer in that area. So I'm just going to talk a little bit to relax and also to give you some sense of what my relation to the Bay Area as a writer in any sense really is. Because, I moved here in 1970 to live, but a lot of people moved here in 1970. Between the 1965 and 1970, I think you saw a lot of people arrive. And at one point, this is I came here first in 1956, and it was the spring of 1956, an extraordinary time in San Francisco. And the friends I'd come particularly to visit were the Dorns, Ed Dorn and his wife then Helene, who were living in on Grove Street in the city. And I think within 24 hours I'd happily met, primarily through his friendships, I'd met Allen Ginsberg and Phil Whalen and Gary Snyder and Jack Kerouac and a whole host of people who were Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I had also a dear friend who I'd met earlier in Mallorca, where I'd lived for a time, Robert Duncan, who in effect gave me introductions, call them, to Jimmy Broughton and to Madeline Gleason, and Kermit Sheets, old-time people of that whole community. But it was an absolutely dazzling moment to be a young man or a young woman in that milieu in San Francisco, simply that it was before the publication of On the Road, it was before the publication of Howells, so that the intensity and concentration of those writers was still primarily let's say, in a communal pattern. I mean, the large and intensive public use of these writers hadn't as yet occurred, so that they really were in a very intensive community. And Michael McClure was a friend met at that point. And later I met Joanne Kiger, Jack Spicer, and other dear friends of that same situation. But I met Gregory Corso. It was a time when San Francisco seemingly was serving as a community nexus for all these diverse patterns and persons of what really comes to be to me the extraordinary revolution in ways of thinking about writing and practicing it that I'd date around the generation coming of age in the 1940s, and coming to public identification in a sense in San Francisco, the so-called San Francisco Renaissance, which triggered really all the subsequent patterns. I mean, the Black Mountain School, or the New York School, or whatever school that's one wants to point to, somehow seems to get a real focus nonetheless here in San Francisco, which was extraordinary. Beat generation writers were all here. Black Mountain was happily represented by Ed and myself were certainly in that situation. And the kind of cluster that's formed by Lou Welch and Phil Whalen and Gary Snyder was also much on the scene. I don't know why it is that San Francisco should be so possible, and I think of other cities that possibly give you the same kind of social patterns, or could, like Boston in some ways could. But I think the eminence of New York, just there on the horizon, tends to diminish or disperse the energies that otherwise are the case in Boston. And LA is seemingly really a painter's city. It never seems to cohere quite as for writers. And then although cities like Chicago will serve very intensely for a time, they too either go to one coast or the other. People tend to move from one coast to the other. But San Francisco, for me, was an absolute revelation. I found a company that's lasted me all my life. In fact, although it's off this, it isn't poetry by any manner of means, but about 2 years ago, a French magazine was doing a kind of pleasant hustle on the whole subject of San Francisco and beat writing, and asked me to write a quick reminiscence of that time, which doesn't happily go on very long at all. But if I can locate it quickly, it's called Random Thoughts on San Francisco, March to June 1956. There are lovely moments in the world when persons and place burn with a like heat, as Olson would say. I finally accept that some intuition or habit or simply coincidence has arranged that this shall be the case, and all those to be blessed truly will be present. I felt that way arriving in San Francisco in March of 1950. The city was humanly so beautiful, but that fact would not have changed my mind in itself. I'd left Black Mountain College just at the turn of the year, in real despair, with a marriage finally ended, separated from my 3 children, very confused as to how to support myself, and so I headed west, for the first time, thinking to be rid of all the easternisms of my New England upbringing and habit. I had friends living in New Mexico, a phenomenal place in its own right, and thought to settle there, but after a month or so I found myself restless, dependent, and in no sense clear as to what might be my next move. An old friend and student from Black Mountain, Ed Dorn, was living in San Francisco, so that's where I headed, to see the Pacific Ocean if nothing else. I got there mid-afternoon, if I remember correctly. Ed and Helene gave me a whirlwind tour of Annie Morris Minor, and we drank a lot and celebrated. Ed told me that Rex Roth had generously invited us to dinner, but that he had to go to work at the Greyhound bus terminal at 6. I and drunker and recall vomiting heavily in the street before going up to Rex Roth's apartment. People had already eaten, tactfully made no point of my late arrival. Later that same night, returning to the Dorns' apartment, I was charmed by the arrival of Allen Ginsberg at midnight. He got off work at the Greyhound terminal at that hour, and we talked much of the night about writing and projective verse and his own interest in Kerouac and Burroughs. My information of the latter was meager, but fascinating. That is, Robert Duncan had told me that Kerouac was the man who had written 1,000 pages in which the only apparent physical action was a neon sign over a storefront flashing off and on. Burroughs, in a story that had him confused with Jack, was said to have been asked at a party to demonstrate his expertise with revolvers by shooting an apple off the head of his wife. A gun was given him, he took aim and fired, and sadly killed her. His apocryphal remark was, "I should never have used a .45, they always undershoot." You know, that is not Burroughs' nature, but Rexroth's weekly evenings proved an intensive meeting place. Then remember there was a bar on Grant Street called The Place. The Place, a great bar with genial host Leo and sometime bartender John Ryan, was another. One night Allen asked the Dorns and myself to meet him there after he got off work so he could introduce us to Jack Kerouac, now back in the city. We got there early and sat at a small table in the front of that small space and waited, peering about to try to figure out which one of the others might be Jack. I was particularly drawn to a man who was sitting up against the back wall on the way to the toilet, seemingly alone, sort of musing, with extraordinary eyes and a head that had somehow larger-than-life-size intensity. When Allen came in, he asked if we'd seen Jack, and we said no. And then he pointed to this man I'd been watching and said, "There he is." But we had little conversation that night, unhappily. Jack was pretty comatose from drinking. And when we all got back to the apartment he was sharing with Al Sublette to eat, the large steak, I remember, kept getting dropped on the floor in the process of being cooked. They were trying to turn it over with a fork and flop on the floor and put it back in the pan. Jack passed out on a bed, and when I was delegated to wake him up, he regarded me with those extraordinary eyes, and I felt like a didactic idiot. Remembering now, it all tends to swirl. Great parties at Loch McCorkle's house out in Mill Valley. It's on Montford Road. As you go past that turnoff, it takes you up on the hill to go over to Bolinas or Stinson. Instead, you continue on maybe, I'd say, 1/8 of a mile, and the house that Loch McCorkle then lived in is sitting right on the right. And it goes up a steep hill in back of it that then had a small cabin up at the top where there would be the immediate house. I think it rented for some incredible amount, like $35 a month. It was this incredible house that Locke did some. Locke was at that point in his life, he was kind of an itinerant non-union carpenter who would work part-time repairing houseboats or building them or doing things like that. And it made him a sufficient and very comfortable living. And he then lived there with his wife and 2 children. And it was a great congregating place for people like from the city as ourselves. And these really charming parties would take place there and last, no hopeless sense. But I remember when Gary was to go first to Japan, that there was a big party given there to celebrate his last night in the city. Anyhow, great parties at Loch McCorkle's house out in Mill Valley, Alan and Peter charmingly dancing naked among a dense pack of clothed bodies, flowers at the prom. Like both Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky were again, it wasn't some extraordinary erotic number. It was more like Trotskyites, demonstrating some point of necessary order, so that their nudity was by no means offensive or even aggressive. It was just they were naked. Which to be naked in Mill Valley, in winter is not as comfortable as it might seem. They had a lot of heart. Jack and I sitting on the sidelines, shy, banging on upended pots and pans, quote, keeping the beat, unquote. Gary Snyder's wise old young eyes, his centeredness and shyness also. Phil Whalen's, quote, well, Creeley, I hope you know what you're doing, unquote. Visits to Mike McClure's with Ed, Ronnie Bladen, upstairs in their undesignated commune. Ronald Bladen was then living with the McClures, and I was trying to think there were 1 or 2 other people sharing the house with them, so that it was like an early old-time form of communal living. and they were all diversely artists. Like Ronnie becomes this extraordinary sculptor subsequently. Let's see, Ronnie Bladen upstairs in their undesignated commune, Mike practicing the trumpet in the cellar, anyhow blasts of sound and talk of Pollock, energy, Lawrence Ferlinghetti standing outside his great and initial City Lights bookstore asking me what living was like in Mallorca, cheap. He'd had the care to review The Gold Diggers, which is an early collection of stories, the only collection of stories I ever published, to review The Gold Diggers for the San Francisco Chronicle, and that was surely a first. Walking around the city with Alan and Phil, Alan reading his Howl, which he had in a big black binder notebook. Each time we'd stop at a curb or in a cafe, Mike's, used to be the old Mike's sandwich shop on Broadway, great Italian food, or just on a bench in a park. Later I typed the stencils for a small edition of that transforming poem. I was trying to get work, and Martha Rexroth gave me the job, as I remember. Alan had given her prior to the City Lights publication. There were other dear friends of that time, James Broughton, an old friend of Duncan's, Kermit Sheets, Madeline Gleason. Duncan himself was in Black Mountain, but his care that I should be at home in the city was so kind. I'd go to them when I was exhausted, and that was frequently. I finally managed to get an apartment on Montgomery Street, though I never succeeded in living there. I did write some poems, though, on a huge typewriter Martha had got me. The Bed, Just Friends, old Charlie Parker favorite, She Went to Stay, a folk song, and Jack's Blues among them. One night I invited the gang over, like they say, and one of the company was a particularly ominous heavy whose pleasure was turning schoolgirls on. There were two with him to heroin, and finally I got freaked. Peter Orlovsky, true angel, somehow managed to clear the whole room of people, then paused himself at the door before leaving to say, "Would you like me to turn off the light?" We talked endlessly. Day and night, we rehearsed our senses of writing, possible publications, shop talk. Jack was not going to let the editors cut up on the road the way they had the town and the city. He was getting himself ready for Malcolm Cowley's impending visit to talk it over, which Jack rightly feared might be heavy-handed advice. Both Ed and I were asked a lot of questions about Olson and his projective verse. Was it just more razzle-dazzle intellectualism? McClure and Whalen were particularly intrigued, and were at this time already in correspondence with him. Alan, as always, was alert to any information of process that might be of use. So time went by, and it was so packed with things happening, it seems now strange to me it was such a short time, only 3 months. Came June, and I was restless again, and so headed back to New Mexico with huge rucksack and sleeping bag Jack had helped me locate. I managed to get all my stuff and Martha's typewriter into the former somehow in an Army surplus store on Market Street. I still have them. The sleeping bag, in fact, is presently on the bed in the next room. Why does that matter? At times it seems all we have of the human possibility to keep the faith, though why an old sleeping bag and a primordial Army issue rucksack, now looking like a faded gray ghost, should be the tokens one must figure for oneself. Each time I drive cross-country in the underpowered, battered VW I likewise hold on to, hitting those Kansas spaces where Burroughs rightly remarked, "One gets the fear." I think of Neil Cassidy and that Pontiac he could wheel round corners as if on a turntable. Pure burning energy. Listening to fantastic Bombay Express Indian record of Locke's, Neil flagging the train on through. People give you life in that way. Things you didn't think you knew or could do. Suddenly it's possible. Answers you never expected to come out of your own mouth. One time after a night-long party at Locke's, people had variously come to rest either in the house at the bottom of the hill, great sloping ground of musky eucalyptus and grass, or else in the small cabin toward the top, kids and big people all together in one heap. Jack proposed he and I sleep outside just to dig that wild soft air and tender darkness. I woke in bright, dazzling morning light with Jack's face inches from mine, asking in mock sternness, "Are you pure?" To which I replied, as if for that moment in his mind, "That's like asking water to be wet." Well, that's a quick flash of that time and those persons. I thought possibly to read a few of the poems that would have come from that time of being in the city. It's just seeing their titles in that. Let's see, the bed. Oh well, this may get so awkward I won't bother to do it. Yeah. Jack's Blues was sort of written with Jack in mind. I'm going to roll up a monkey and smoke it, put an elephant in the pot. I'm going out and never come back. What's better than that? Lying on your back, flat on your back, with your eyes to the view. Oh, the view is blue. I saw that too, yesterday, and you, red eyes and blue, funked. I'm going to roll up a rug and smoke it, put the car in the garage, and I'm gone like a sad old candle. One other I read from that time, and leap instantly to the present, which is dear fellow poet John Ashbery has a like they say, a great line in a recent poem. Says, "The present is here to stay," which takes a long time to recognize is the case. The present is here to stay. If you, where is it? This was the title of a pleasant sort of chapbook portfolio that I think it was Henry Evans, who was then a printer in the city, put together, and was an old friend of Martha Rexroth's, and he published it with charming wood blocks or prints by Fielding Dawson. If you were going to get a pet, what kind of animal would you get? A soft-bodied dog, a hen, feathers and fur to begin it again. When the sun goes down and it gets dark, I saw an animal in a park. Bring it home to give it to you. I have seen animals break in two. You were hoping for something soft and loyal and clean and wondrously careful. A form of otherwise vicious habit can have long ears and be called a rabbit. Dead, died, will die, want. Morning, midnight, I asked you, if you were going to get a pet, what kind of animal would you get? These go back, that would go back almost 20 years. But I was thinking, I suppose the preoccupation of my life writing would be endlessly in terms of how relations are felt or experienced, how one person thus relates to another, how that occurs, how it's felt, how it's imagined, how it's experienced. And that seemingly is an endless preoccupation. A form of women. I've come far enough from where I was not before to have seen the things looking in at me through the open door, and have walked tonight by myself to see the moonlight and see it as trees and shapes more fearful, because I feared what I did not know, but have wanted to know. My face is my own, I thought, but you have seen it turn into 1,000 years. I watched you cry. I could not touch you. I wanted very much to touch you, but could not. If it is dark, when this is given to you, have care for its content when the moon shines. My face is my own. My hands are my own. My mouth is my own. But I am not. Moon, moon, when you leave me alone, all the darkness is an utter blackness, a pit of fear, a stench, hands unreasonable, never to touch. But I love you. Do you love me? What to say when you see me? The rain. All night the sound had come back again, and again falls this quiet, persistent rain. What am I to myself that must be remembered, insisted upon so often? Is it that never the ease, even the hardness of rain falling, will have for me something other than this, something not so insistent? Am I to be locked in this final uneasiness? Love, if you love me, lie next to me. Be for me like rain, the getting out of the tiredness, the fatuousness, the semi-lust of intentional indifference. Be wet with a decent happiness. So there's one, I think this awful, sad, the horror of that whole awful effect of the earthquake in Guatemala last week. And at one point in the late 50s, 59 to 61, we'd been in Guatemala where I had a job tutoring children on the children of the owner's children on 2 coffee plantations. And so for those 2 years, we got, we had an extraordinary information of what life commonly was like in that situation of those old-time heavy ownership patterns, almost like a feudal, ownership circumstance. I mean, in the most extraordinary physical beauty, where, say, if you cut posts for a fence and secured them, very soon after the posts themselves would begin to sprout, much as cuttings from a plant or whatnot. The whole fence would start to grow, and people starving in a situation where things can be grown so physically simply, just unbelievable. And the range and the largest cause of mortality in Guatemala when we were there was internal infestation of internal parasites. So the people were literally suffocated by the flooding of worms, up into their, from the stomach up through the throat. Or the first year we were there, I remember in this town of, say, 200 or 300 people, 24 children died of whooping cough. And when we got there was a typhus epidemic in full force. Typhoid, typhus, dysentery of both varieties, amoebic dysentery, endless. So that some such awful event as that natural, terrifying cataclysmic phenomenon would have literally no resources wherewith to deal with it whatsoever. I mean, the Guatemalan Federal Board of Health had funds to put a team in the field for 2 weeks out of the entire year to deal with the epidemic situation of filaria. Just incredible. I mean, I was told once, and it was not apocryphal, that you get anyone in that country murdered at will for $5 was it $25, including the president, It's an incredible, less than 1% of that less than 1% of that country's persons own something like 99% of its physical and economic wealth, So one man I worked for felt that the Indians were literally I would be concerned, understandably, I think. The prevalence of hepatitis was extraordinary, and so we had Sarah and Kate, her younger sister, and older sister Kirsten were all, let's say, ages like 4th grade to Kate was then just a baby, and I, in my weird American innocence, had brought this tender group into this incredible place. And we were there. Man, it was 3,000 miles straight north to get to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where it would otherwise be living. And in this old VW Combi, one of the prototypes. And the only thing we had as hope in the world was to keep that damn thing running, no matter what. And so as to be able to get out. And my salary, I guess, was $3,000 for the year with a kind of one of the old incidental persons' houses thrown in as a living place, which was good. I mean, it's certainly better far than most persons in that situation had. But the incredible distance between the patron and the worker was just, I think their base pay was like $12 every 2 weeks. And a common shirt, a shirt like this would cost in the Guatemalan market about $10 to $12. You have to work 2 weeks to get a shirt. Arbenz' government had fallen simply that he could get no cooperation from the landowners otherwise, and they just left him without technocracy of any order. And things began to fall apart economically. He lost his fund. He lost his, power base, so to speak. It's an incredible country. I mean, we were there during Kennedy's use of Guatemala as a staging number for the invasion of Cuba. I always wondered what all those American soldiers were doing in Guatemala City all the time, especially large numbers of Air Force used to be whooping it up and down the main street. There was no particular explanation as to why why were so many American soldiers present. Well, they were there to train for the ill-fated Bay of Pigs trip, But again, this government had so little, had authority, but it was all ownership authority. I mean, for example, the milk we drank commonly in Guatemala was shipped in from California. Foremost, they had a deal with the federal government to create this weird subsidy for the hauling in of powdered milk, in a country, again, which had every, adequate possibility for having its own dairy situation. Endless. I don't know. Very sad. So I want to get off that as a reality. I wrote that poem there. And another poem was written there, I remember. The name. Be natural, wise, as you can be, my daughter. But my name be in you flesh I gave you in the act of loving your mother, all your days, her ways, the woman in you brought from sensuality's measure, no other. There was no thought of it, but such pleasure all women must be in her as you. But not wiser, not more of nature than her hair, the eyes she gives you. There will not be another woman such as you are. Remember your mother, the way you came, the days of waiting. Be natural, daughter, wise as you can be, all my daughters. Be women for men when that time comes. Let the rhetoric stay with me, your father. Let me talk about it, saving you such vicious self-exposure. Let you. One last poem from this book, which is the title poem. And this again was written probably in the late 50s. For love. Yesterday I wanted to speak of it, that sense above the others, to me important, because all that I know derives from what it teaches me. Today, what is it that is finally so helpless, different, despairs of its own statement, wants to turn away, endlessly, to turn away? If the moon did not, no, if you did not, I wouldn't either. But what would I not do? What prevention? What thing so quickly stopped? That is love yesterday or tomorrow, not now. Can I eat what you give me? I have not earned it. Must I think of everything as earned? Now love also, becomes a reward, so remote from me I have only made it with my mind. Here is tedium, despair, a painful sense of isolation, and whimsical, if pompous, self-regard. But that image is only of the mind's vague structure, vague to me, because it is my own. Love, what do I think to say? I cannot say it. What have you become to ask? What have I made you into? Companion, good company, crossed legs with skirt, or soft body under, the bones of the bed. Nothing says anything but that which it wishes would come true, fears what else might happen in some other place, some other time, not this one. A voice in my place, an echo of that only in yours. Let me stumble into, not the confession, but the obsession I begin with, now, for you, also, some time beyond place, or place beyond time, no mind left to say anything at all, that face gone now, into the company of love. It all returns. But I was thinking that, can I eat what you give me? I have not earned it. That I love to pay my own way, so to speak, as I dare say many here do too. But again, it's a sad limit of being human if we can't accept what comes to us with no such if we can't accept our so-called luck or what's simply directed toward us as affection or whatever. I mean, if we have to always think that our only possible return, let's say, in the sad way, is if all we get in the world is what we've earned, we probably won't get much at all, no matter what we do, you know. Yeah. I'd like to go to more recent poems. See what's to the point. Does someone have an ashtray or a cup I could use? Thank you. I've got matches, but I need now. Thank you. I can just put a little water in there and use it. Oh, that's great. There's some water in there. Terrific. Well, I'll read you two, actually. There's one that coming back to, or really coming more particularly to live in San Francisco, or rather in Bolinas. We've come in no easy pattern. I think exhausted. We'd been that spring, 1970, in Buffalo, New York, where I was teaching, and those of you who had any involvement with teaching or with being a student at that time can recall the extraordinary horrors of that spring when the Kent State killings occurred, and the killings also in the South. And then when campuses generally were in a state of near riot and chaos. I saw an old friend last weekend, Edgar Friedenberg, who'd been a colleague at Buffalo in that time, who's himself an extraordinary critic or commentator, let's say, on American or educational patterns generally, but particularly on American educational patterns. And he recalled a mutual friend, a student, having heard me say in some awful moment of not confusion, but just wanting to, saying, well, we were debating whether it would be better to be gassed or to be beaten, since those seems to be the options that most students then had. And I recall as a teacher wanting to continue classes and some responsibility to being not merely hired to do so, but having people expecting to have them as meeting places and, situation where you hopefully get some kind of information that you had in mind to have, or some discussion of some information that was crucial to your own interests. And to have all that stop was really hard. I mean, socially and personally. It wasn't you wanted to maintain business as usual, but you wanted to maintain the integrity of that community of interest. On the other hand, if you met in the usual classrooms, you simply identified where you were and subjected particularly your students to all kinds of harassment as they came and went from those meeting places. And there were, in Buffalo at least, there were very absolute beatings of people, women and men, slashing of tires, cordons of police surrounding them and then hitting them and macing them and all the rest. In other words, there was a state of extraordinary civil hysteria that the community and the police as well had sadly, gone into. I don't say they were without provocation, that would be absurd, but let's say their reaction was in far, far more than would seem, justifiably the case. It's an old working class city, and there was already an attitude towards students that they were in some ways extraordinarily privileged people in the social group, which in some ways was truly the case in that community. And to see any conduct on their part that didn't seem to respect the fact that they had this, extraordinary privilege. They had a chance to get out of the, steel mills and the factories, otherwise the case, and if they didn't respect it in a way that community understandably supposed that they should, they were thought to be just, punks and little wise guys, and there was real frustration then, let out. They were really horribly treated. Anyhow, so we came. I'd been invited to teach in San Francisco State for a year, and I took the place of Kay Boyle when she went on. She herself was obviously exhausted from her, time with Hayakawa and that whole trip. But it was incredible. Parents, I recall, and James Michener wrote a kind of text involved with the Kent State circumstances, and as part of his research, he interviewed or had interviewed a number of parents of students there, and found those people in such awful human consternation and I think true confusion that parents were now saying, an extraordinary percentage of parents thus questioned were saying, yes, if their sons or daughters had been attacked or killed in this fashion, they would have thought it a righteous act, It's incredible, It's incredible how many parents themselves felt this extraordinary confusion apropos of the situation of their own children. So he felt that was a cop-out. Anyhow, I came to San Francisco. We had several old friends living in Bolinas. Arthur Okamura, extraordinary painter of this area, who's been living here now for at least 20 or more years, variously around the Bay. He had a studio in Berkeley, taught for a long, long time, and still does, in part. Absolutely extraordinary is Tom Clark, and Joanne Kiger is an absolutely dear friend. All my poems are, I don't know who understands them and why they're printed, but I'm not going to argue with them. I'm certainly not going to argue with anyone apropos. Bolinas and Me, this poem is like really egocentric. For Stan Persky, and those in the company who would not remember that, and a true genius of this place for a long time was Jack Spicer, who was this legendary poet who none of us, apart from, say, living in San Francisco, those of us who are living in other parts of the country would have very fugitive senses of Jack's actual writing, because he absolutely insisted that writing be local and that it be the activity of an actual community of persons, and that it not get hooked up with some awful exploitation of itself as commercial value or big stardom or that kind of stuff. He for time edited a magazine, and the one injunction upon its publication was that it should not leave the city, that it was considered a very dire offense to slip that magazine out of the city to any friend or interest otherwise not present. And he'd print almost anything. He had a box for a long time in the place, and if you wanted your poems published, you'd just put them in that box, and sooner or later they'd see the light of day in his magazine. He wanted it completely without the usual kinds of didactic, editing or criticism or whatever. He just wanted an absolutely communal magazine. And he was a true genius as a poet. Happily now his collected books are published, edited by another dear person of this city, Robin Blazer, and you can get them from Black Sparrow. But Jack was an extraordinary mentor for a number of younger writers, as Joanne Kiger, George Stanley, Stan Persky, to whom this poem is dedicated. Richard Brautigan actually learned an extraordinary amount of his ability to write from Jack Spicer, and would say so without question. Of that part of the country you get hold of, he'd read it. So he enrolled as a student at UBC, which Bolinas and me for Stan Persky. Bolinas and me, believe me. Roy Kayuka, not here, says that. Say this: the yearning human situation, wanting something to be, which is. What's wanted? Let the man put the gas in your car, John, e.g., complete doing what you wanted him to. Have done with it? Ham on rye. The sea, the drive along the coast in L.A. I remember Joanne. I want to. She's lovely, one says. So she is. So are you too. Or one. Have done with it. You see that line of rocks out there? Water, waves, 2 dead sea lions, says Peter. He's lovely, all of them. Let's walk down to the beach. See, the sea, say. If you love someone, you'd better believe it. And or you could write that all night, all right, all wrong, all isn't enough. I want to get going. Here's love. Drive home, up through the mountains, dense fog. See the car lights, make way of it. See the night all around. Bleed into the toilet 2 nights, 2 days, away from whatever. Go home and stay there. I want to walk around here. Look at the people, pretty. Look at the houses. Stop in the bar, get the mail, get going again, somewhere. 1, 2, 3, 4. Husbands and fathers. Sweet love, sweet love. The kids come by on bicycles, the little, increasingly large people in the rain. The liquor store lights shine out in the night, and one is walking, going, coming in the night. Holy place we stand in, these changes, Thanksgiving, in the circle of oaks, the sun going west, a glowing white-yellow through the woods, to the west, all the distance. Things move, you've come to here, by one thing after another, and are here. Flat thoughts in recalling, something after, nostalgic twist of everything so thought, a period of thought here. Hair falling, black tangle, standing in front of the fire, love dancing, silent, a figure, a feeling, felt and moving here. After all, it speaks less in saying more. It, the hunk of wood is not burning. Marriage burns, soars, all day the roar of it, from the lovely barn space, the people, the plenitude of all in the open clearing, the sunlight, lovely densities. I am slowly going, coming home. Let go of it. Walking and walking. Dream of those voices, people again, not quite audible, though I can see them, colors, forms, a chatter just back of the ear, moving toward them, the edge of the woods, again and again and again. How insistent this blood one thinks of as in the body, these hands, this face. Bolinas sits on the ground by the sea, sky overhead. I wanted that final Bolinas sits on the ground by the sea, sky overhead. I want something would not just flatten it out, but make it as literally and generally present as a physical place as one could say it. That part about the marriage burns sores. An old friend, now sadly dead, had built himself an extraordinary house, and there was a wedding of two friends who still are old-time neighbors in Bolinas, Ebba and Angela Beauregard, Ebba himself a poet and carpenter. And there was the marriage performed in this incredible old-time community pattern, with people getting up to give testament to their marriage or to the circumstances thus related. It was one of the most moving human things I think I'd ever been present to. Yeah. Or, since she's, for the graduation, Bolinas School, June 11th, 1971, for Sarah. Pretension has it, you can't get back what's gone by. Yet I don't believe it. The sky in this place stays here, and the sun comes or goes and comes again on the same day. We live in a circle, older or younger. We go round and around on this earth. I was trying to remember what it was like at your age. The same old friend I mentioned, and how lovely printer who's had worked for a long time, is fragile, as apparently it wants to be. Wind on the ocean, trees moving in wind and rain. Trees moving in wind and rain. If I can find any more of those poems. As you come down the road, it swings slowly left, and the sea opens below you, west. It sounds out. Or as we sit, this is sitting down by the channel between Stinson and Bolinas. There is a long stretch of sky before us. There is a long stretch of sky before us. The sand goes out to the channel of the water. Birds fly in the faintly white sky. A sound shuffles over and over, shifting sand and water. A wind blows steadily as we sit. I want to say very give a damn poem for Ebba's birthday. So finally it came down to these two lines. It was for Ebba and Ebba with love. So I figured that's all you get this year, Ebba, you know. It's funny. See if I can find the last of them. The last year I wrote a poem for the great authors. I believe it was Jane, who was, and I can find it somewhere. There's another one. And simply looking around the pleasure of the company, the first couple of lines of this poem just came to home and completed it. And one thing that really attracted me about these three poems, one written each year, like 71, 72, and 73, that the insistent image of the poems was that the world is round. I mean, that, without coming back as the center in the things being said, the sense of a circle, really going back, you know, the circle be unbroken, you know. Our whole concept of our whole experience of human faith is as keeping the circle intact. And I mean, I suppose like a wedding ring or something of the obvious significance of that, to come into the circle in senses of magic, on it and around and around. What will happen? That is the happiness of the circle finding you. I like the fact that happiness are this, so to speak. These ones you're happy something's happened. If nothing happened, you wouldn't be happy. I know I wouldn't be happy if nothing happened. Well, I've lost track of time again. Does anybody have I had a watch when it came, but I so characteristically have one. I can't even remember where I put it. 8:31. What's the usual, so to speak, to you? got this earlier, but I'd tell you what would be useful to me, anything that they have in mind as a question, anything they'd like to, I always feel it's inappropriate to take a position upon your attention in mind that you'd like to bring up or in. I'd be really, yeah.
You mentioned your knowledge of Kerouac.
Right.
DC or Wolf.
No, the time that I knew Jack was just that 56. We had some correspondence subsequently, but he sadly took him far away from where I was commonly living. So I never saw him again. I had to say a few letters now and then, and would have word of him through mutual friends as Allen Ginsberg and Peter and Gregory and so on. But he began to be more and more, I'd be drinking heavily, more paranoid, more separated by the sad commercial uses that people seemingly on him, or that he accepted. So Ken Kesey, I'd see Neil from time to time when I'd been in San Francisco. I never had the opportunity to meet Ken Kesey, which I would have. And Tom Wolfe, it tends to be primarily an activity that keeps to a relatively small nucleus of persons that's involved. That can be very extensive, significant. I mean, I want to say that poetry for me is a personal art, although it can have an incredible, extension in time and space. It's most intensive and most active, I think, in a relatively small nucleus of people, so that it communicates itself almost, I want to say, cluster to cluster. I mean, it gives us extraordinary information of our internal factual lives. In that information, it is unique. I mean, it really gives witness or actuates or states a whole area of being human that otherwise has no articulation, except that it does happen. I mean, you can hear or read or thus, find communication with states of human experience that have, I think, pretty truly no other way in which to transmit, or if they do, they have no way that can be dependably looked at or gone to as a source. I mean, a letter, let's say, from a friend may communicate some extraordinary experience of feeling that he or she is having, that you as the person receiving the letter will then thus be permitted to enter. But, you can, go to something as common as a public library and read some poems by whomever, and you will have very possibly that same nature of communication occurring, but without the necessity, of having it be a letter specifically to you, It will be a letter. I mean, Whitman's incredible saying, who touches this book touches a man. There's no extraordinary metaphor in that statement whatsoever. It's true. Who touches this book touches a man. Who reads these words and experiences them as being said, and hears them in his or her head or mind or heart, enters the experience of that situation of feeling with which the writer was possessed. And that ability to communicate is extraordinarily dear. And I don't think, in that respect, it will ever go out or die. It becomes at various points ritualized again in the social habits of the group. I mean, poetry among, say, American Indians or persons who have a strong collective pattern of living together as people can be used to ritualize, the social information of the whole group, can specify them specifically as humans, or can make them specifically articulate as human beings in that place and time. As people become more fragmented in their social patterns, or more, diversely or awkwardly placed, it would seem that poetry becomes a much more personal art, an art that speaks of one person to another one person. So that our poetry in this country has been primarily personal poetry, or lyric poetry. And we have few poets who have a large collective, articulation, as is the case in Russia, for example, or in other poetries of other cultures. But the specific experience of being physically and emotionally and intellectually an American, I think, finds voice, like they say in our poetry, perhaps more articulately than any other form of our activity. despite the fact that we share with other species the ability to communicate in diverse patterns and ways, but our human words are entirely, I mean, humans die, words die with them, you know. No one else will ever remember the passive periphrastic or, you know, what's the case of this word or that, or what tense is this verb in, all that kind of incredible, laborious, logistical patterning that we've evolved to define what we're doing, you know, as people speaking. My mother, when my sister lived in Berkeley for about 10 years with her family. Her husband was then working for a UNESCO-funded educational research group. He's a New Zealander who came first to this country to teach at the University of Wyoming, and then from that situation went into this educational research group. And then when it closed down in the late 60s, as the funding began to be tight, he went back to teaching, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is simply that my mother lived with him for part of the 60s. After my aunt died, her sister, she then moved from Florida, where she'd been living in an old-time trailer park, to Berkeley, where my sister lived. And then the family then moved back to Wyoming, and then the altitude was thought to be some hardship for my mother. So the last year of her life, she came to spend with us in Bolinas, and then that summer we all went east to Gloucester, which is close to where she grew up, and that was dear. And then we returned to Bolinas in September, and my mother was increasingly feeling lousy with some kind of abdominal, some kind of constriction or some kind of block in her intestines, apparently. Diagnosed by a really good news doctor in Point Reyes, thus argued that she possibly would be relieved by an operation, but she was then 85, so that she and